The letter had not said she was named in the will. It had said only that the late Duke of Ashmore had a matter regarding your father to resolve, and that her presence at the reading on the 14th of October would oblige the estate. Clara Bowman had read those words 3 times in the gray morning light of her rented room in Whitmore Village, then folded the paper and placed it inside her father's Bible because it was the only place she kept things that required safekeeping. She had told herself on the coach that she was going to hear something small. A mention? A token bequest for service. A name read aloud before the real business began, and then her father's name forgotten again as it had been for 20 years. She had told herself that, and she had been entirely wrong. The anteroom of Ashmore's solicitor, Mr. Graves, smelled of beeswax and old paper. A long walnut table occupied the center of the room. At one end sat the family: Dorothea Ashmore, Lady Ashmore, the old Duke's sister-in-law, erect in dove-black silk with mourning jewels at her throat, a black feathered fan held at precisely the correct angle of dignified grief. Beside her sat Norton Ashmore, the Duke's nephew, 28, with the soft impatience of a man already rehearsing ownership. There were 2 other gentlemen whose names Clara did not catch, and a woman in lavender who was introduced to her by no one. At the other end of the table, standing rather than seated, was a man Clara had not seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a slight forward lean of a man accustomed to bearing responsibility. His hair was dark brown, cut close at the sides, worn without powder. His eyes, when they moved briefly to find her in the doorway, were gray-green and very still. A thin scar ran along his left temple. He wore a dark navy-fitted tailcoat with brass buttons, a high white cravat, buff breeches. He looked at her with an expression that gave away nothing at all. "Miss Bowman," said Mr. Graves, rising. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." She sat in the only remaining chair, which was at the side of the table, equidistant between the family and the man at the far end. She placed her hands in her lap and waited. The man at the far end was Henry Cavendish, Earl of Thornmere. She learned this when Mr. Graves said, "Lord Thornmere, as executor, will read the relevant provisions." She learned the rest of his significance only gradually, the way one learns the shape of a room by moving through it in the dark. Lord Thornmere opened the document. He read the preliminary provisions in a voice that was level and unhurried, each clause receiving its full weight without theatricality. The house went to Norton Ashmore, held in trust. The London property to the second gentleman whose name she had not caught. The library contents to the Ashmore Parish Church. Then Lord Thornmere paused, and she noticed that his eyes had moved from the document to the room, as though confirming the room's readiness, and then he read the last provision. The Ashmore Dower House, with its 240 acres of attached farmland, its contents entire, and a settled annual income of £600, were bequeathed to Miss Clara Bowman, spinster, of Whitmore, in the county of Surrey, daughter of the late Edmund James Bowman, formerly head stableman of this estate. The room stopped. Lady Ashmore's fan did not move. The nephew's hand, which had been resting loosely on the table, became a fist. The woman in lavender made a sound that was not quite a word. Clara sat very still and heard nothing, for a moment, beyond her own pulse. If you have ever stood in a room and understood, in a single instant, that the ground had shifted beneath every person present, and that you were somehow the cause of it, you will know what she felt in that anteroom on the 14th of October, in the autumn of 1811. Stay with her a moment. What she felt was not triumph. What she felt was a very great, very cold fear, and underneath it, like a coal too long covered, a single burning question. Why? Lord Thornmere set the document down. The provisions are complete, he said. His voice was as level as it had been at the beginning. No one spoke for the length of a slow breath. "There must be an error," he said. His voice was careful, practiced. "There is no error," said Lord Thornmere. "I reviewed the document with Mr. Graves prior to this reading. It is properly executed and witnessed." "She is a stableman's daughter," said the nephew, as though this constituted legal argument. "She is the named beneficiary," said Lord Thornmere. "The document is binding." She did not look at him. She looked at her hands, which were perfectly still in her lap, which was either composure or shock, and she was not certain which. The afternoon passed in pieces she could not quite assemble. There were forms to sign, and she signed them, because Mr. Graves directed her hand to each blank space with the patient efficiency of a man who had seen all manner of human reaction to inheritance and had stopped being surprised by any of it. Lord Thornmere spoke to the solicitor in low tones near the window while she signed. Lady Ashmore did not speak again at all. She sat with her fan in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and her expression of a woman recalibrating in private. And that silence, Clara thought, was more frightening than anything he had said aloud. She was driven to Ashmore that same afternoon. A carriage was arranged. Lord Thornmere had ordered it, apparently, before the reading had concluded, which she would understand later as the first instance of a pattern she would come to recognize. He arranged things before they became necessary. Quietly, without announcement, as if disorder were a personal affront he had decided simply not to permit. The estate came into view through the carriage window as the October light was failing. Stone walls gray gold in the last of it. The gravel forecourt swept clean. The stables at a distance behind the main house, showing their dark timber frames against the pale sky. It was larger than she had allowed herself to imagine. She had known her father worked here for 20 years. She had never been brought to the house itself. She had been 11 years old when Edmund Bowman died. She remembered his hands more clearly than his face, broad and careful, smelling of hay and leather oil. She had thought, sometimes, that the estate he served must have owed him something. She had never thought it would come to this. The housekeeper, a composed woman of 50 named Mrs. Holt, met her at the door with perfect correctness and showed her to a set of rooms in the east wing. The east wing was not the main house. She was aware of this. She did not require explanation. It was the following morning that she encountered Lady Ashmore for the first time outside the solicitor's anteroom. She had come down early, uncertain of the household's breakfast customs, and had paused in the corridor outside the morning room when she heard voices within. The door stood slightly open. She had not yet put her hand to it when she heard Lady Ashmore's voice, low and unhurried, with the conversational ease of a woman speaking in her own home. "Norton, the situation is perfectly manageable. The stable girl knows no one of consequence and has no counsel of her own. Graves will review the document again. There will be grounds." Clara did not push the door open. She turned and went back to her room and ate nothing, and sat with her father's Bible in her lap and her hands quiet on the cover, and thought about the word, grounds. Lord Thornmere arrived at Ashmore that afternoon. She had not known he would be staying. She learned this from Mrs. Holt, who conveyed the information in the tone of a woman relaying the ordinary movements of the household, which perhaps they were. She was crossing the entrance hall when he came through the front door, removing his gloves, and he saw her at the same moment she saw him. He paused. "Miss Bowman," he said. "You settled well, I hope." "I did. Thank you, my lord." He studied her for a moment with those gray-green eyes, the scar at his temple catching the hall light. "You will use the east wing while matters are resolved," he said. "Not a question. Not precisely a suggestion." The main house is not your immediate concern. The dower house keys will be presented to you once the inventory is complete." "When will that be?" she said. "A week? Perhaps 10 days?" She looked at him steadily. "And the week between? Am I to remain a guest in a house that would rather I were gone?" His expression did not change. "You are the named heir to Ashmore Dower House, Miss Bowman. You remain here until you may take possession. That is the executor's determination." A pause. "Come to me if there is difficulty." She did not know whether he meant it as protection or as bureaucratic instruction. She suspected, watching him turn toward the study, that he did not himself know the difference. He had known the old Duke, as she gathered this from fragments of overheard conversation, from the way Mrs. Holt spoke of him, from the quiet authority with which he moved through a house that was not his own, and yet was clearly familiar to him. He had been named executor 3 years ago, when the Duke's health had first declined. He came to Ashmore 4 times a year. He knew which stone on the front step was loose. He knew that the study fire smoked if the flue was not opened a full inch before the kindling caught. He had also, she would learn, been a widower for 3 years. His wife had been called Margaret. There was no portrait of her visible at Thornmere, which was how she knew the loss was not the kind a man decorates. It was the kind he carries. None of this she knew yet, on that first afternoon. She knew only that he was the most contained person she had ever encountered, and that his containment made her feel, obscurely, as though her own composure was a smaller, less tested thing than she had believed it to be. On the 3rd morning, she went to the stables. She had not told anyone she was going. She rose before the household proper and walked the gravel forecourt as the light came up pale and thin behind the eastern trees. The stable block was older than the main house, its timber frames dark with age, the cobblestones between the loose boxes worn to a smoothness that spoke of decades of crossing and recrossing. She could smell hay and horse and cold morning air, and the smell stopped her at the open doorway with a force she had not anticipated. She walked the length of the block. Most of the stalls were occupied. A chestnut mare in the 3rd box lifted her head and watched Clara without alarm. The 6th stall, at the far end, was empty. She did not know why she stopped there. She stood at the gate and looked at the clean straw and the empty hay rack, and something in her chest turned over slowly, the way a coal turns when the air finds it. "The head stableman's stall," said Mrs. Holt, who had told her this the previous afternoon. "Mr. Bowman kept it himself. After he died, His Grace would not let it be reassigned." She had not known that. She put her hand on the gate and let the cold iron settle against her palm. "I do not know why he did it," she said. To the empty stall, to the clean straw, to the absent man who had worked here for 20 years. Her voice was very quiet. "I do not know what you did to deserve it, or what he believed I had done. I want you to know that I have not claimed anything. I have only come to understand it." A pause. "And if I find that it was a mistake, I will say so. I will give it back. I did not come here for the house." She stood there for another moment, her hand on the gate. Then she became aware of the quality of silence above her, and she looked up. Henry Cavendish, Earl of Thornmere, was standing in the hayloft doorway above the far end of the block. He had been there. She understood in an instant, since before she arrived. He was quite still. His gray-green eyes were on her face. The thin scar at his left temple was very clear in the early light, and his expression was entirely different from every expression she had seen him wear in the house. He did not speak. She did not speak. She lowered her hand from the gate, straightened her back, and walked the length of the block and out into the forecourt, and did not look back. Her heart was beating faster than the walk warranted. The morning air was cold on her face and her hands, and she put them together in front of her as she crossed the gravel, fingers laced, steadying herself against something she could not precisely name. That afternoon, Lord Thornmere asked her to walk with him in the kitchen garden. She went because it was not precisely a question. He fell into step beside her with that particular stillness of his, the crunch of gravel loud between them, the bare October kitchen beds stretching away in their orderly rows. "You have been to the stables," he said. "Yes." "Mrs. Holt tells me you went alone." "Is there a rule against it?" A pause. "No." Another pause. "The old Duke," he said, and stopped. He did not often hesitate, she had noticed, so the hesitation was significant. He was not a sentimental man. What he did, the bequest, was not sentiment. "I know," she said. "Or I suspect. I do not know why." He looked at the bare kitchen beds. "He left something with the will," he said. "A small packet. I have been instructed to give it to you when you have had time to settle." He reached into his coat and produced it. A chamois leather pouch, sealed with a wax disc bearing no crest. Inside, she could feel through the leather, a small, hard object, the shape of a key. "He said you would know what it opened," said Lord Thornmere, "when the time was right." She took the pouch. The key shifted against the leather with a small, cold sound. "He was watching me," she said slowly. "Wasn't he? He was watching for some time." "I believe so." She looked down at the pouch in her hands. "He watched my father work here for 20 years and never told him he was grateful. And then my father died. And the old Duke spent the rest of his life sitting with what he had not said." Her voice was steady. "I think that is what this is." Lord Thornmere did not answer immediately. She glanced at him sideways and found him looking at her, not at the garden. "You look at me sometimes," she said, "as though I have done something wrong." The stillness that came over him then was different from his ordinary stillness. It was effortful. "I do not think you have done something wrong," he said. "Then what do you think?" He turned away and looked at the stone wall at the garden's edge. A long moment passed. "I think the old Duke was wiser than I have given him credit for," he said at last. "And I think the rest of it is not mine to say." He left her there, in the bare kitchen garden, the chamois pouch warm in her hands and the key moving against her palm. She watched him go, the navy coat, the level set of his shoulders, the quality of a man walking away from something he had decided, for now, not to face. What he could not have told her, what the narrator may tell you, is this. He had buried a wife and a child 3 years ago, and had not permitted himself to feel a single uncalculated thing since. He had been executor of everything within reach, his estate, his tenants, his grief. He had ordered it all with the same level competence he brought to Ashmore's affairs, and it had worked perfectly until a woman in a plain gray gown stood in an empty stable stall and offered aloud to give back what she had not asked for. If this story is finding you in a quiet moment, and you have felt what it is to watch someone carry their dignity with more grace than the world deserves to witness, tell us, in the thread below. What someone does when they think no one is looking tells you more than all their public performances combined. Stay with Clara a little longer. The answer she is looking for is closer than she knows. The dinner, 3 nights later, was Lady Ashmore's production in every sense. She had arranged it, Clara suspected, with the deliberateness of a general deploying troops. The long dining table in the oak-paneled room held 14 guests, all of them connected to the Ashmore name by blood or alliance, all of them therefore connected to a position on the question of the will. Clara had been placed at the lower end of the table, beside a clergyman who addressed all his remarks to the salt cellar, and across from the nephew, who addressed his to her with the pointed courtesy of a man conducting a public interview. "It must be strange," he said, midway through the second course, "to find oneself so suddenly in company one is unaccustomed to." "I am quite comfortable, thank you," said Clara. "I only mean that the circumstances are unusual. Even His Grace's most devoted admirers must allow that the bequest is, shall we say, eccentric. Eccentricity is a quality attributed most freely to choices we find inconvenient," said Clara. The clergyman looked at the salt cellar with renewed interest. "The stable girl has opinions," said Lady Ashmore from her end of the table. Her voice was perfectly modulated, addressed to the table generally, as if she were making a mild observation about the weather. How refreshing! The room's attention moved, collectively, like a tide. Clara felt it, the shift in the air, the quality of 14 people listening while pretending not to. She kept her eyes on her plate and her hands in her lap, and she thought steadily of her father's hands. Broad and careful. The smell of hay and leather oil. Lord Thornmere, seated at the table's center to Lady Ashmore's right, set his glass down. The sound of it was not loud, it was deliberate. Lady Ashmore's fan, which had been in motion, stilled. "The subject of the bequest," Lord Thornmere said, "is concluded. The document was reviewed and confirmed 3 days ago." He picked up his glass again. "Shall we continue with supper?" It was not a question. The clergyman said something to the salt cellar. Conversation resumed, fitfully, around the edges of the table. Clara looked at Lord Thornmere. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Lady Ashmore, and the look was the same one he had worn in the hayloft doorway, a look that had put something down and intended it to stay down. Lady Ashmore returned his gaze with her dark gray eyes and her level social confidence, and then, in a motion of nearly perfect subtlety, she looked away. Clara ate the rest of the second course, with a steadiness that cost her more than it appeared to cost her. The letter from London arrived 2 days after the dinner. It was addressed to Mr. Graves and copied to Lord Thornmere, and its contents were conveyed to Clara by the solicitor in the East Wing sitting room with the careful neutrality of a man who had expected something of this kind. The nephew had engaged a solicitor of his own. A petition had been filed to examine the will's validity on grounds of the testator's diminished capacity in his final months. A hearing was to be arranged. "What does this mean in practical terms?" said Clara. "It means," said Mr. Graves, "that the bequest is suspended pending examination. You retain use of the East Wing rooms. You may not yet take possession of the Dower House." "How long will the examination take?" "Some weeks. Possibly longer, if the petitioner is persistent." She thanked him, and he left. She sat in the East Wing sitting room with the letter on the table before her and the chamois pouch in her coat pocket, where she had taken to carrying it. And she looked at the gray October afternoon outside the window for a long time. That evening, the housemaid Ellen came to her room with a warming pan and a face that was too carefully arranged to be comfortable. "Lady Ashmore asked me to pass something along," Ellen said. She set the warming pan at the foot of the bed and kept her eyes on it. She said to tell you that the stable girl would be back in her village before the month was out." A pause. "I'm sorry, miss. She said it in front of 3 people. I thought you ought to know." Clara listened to Ellen's footsteps go down the corridor and out of earshot, and then she opened her traveling case and began, methodically, to pack. She was not fleeing. She was clear about this in her own mind. She was removing herself from a house that did not want her, before her presence there became a burden rather than a right, because rights without the capacity to defend them were not rights so much as targets. She would go to Mr. Graves's office in the morning and tell him she intended to remove to Whitmore until the hearing. She would leave her address. She would wait. She was folding her second dress when she thought of the key. She sat down on the edge of the bed with the chamois pouch in her hand, and the key cold through the leather. He said you would know what it opened. When the time was right. She had not been to the stables since that early morning. She had not tried the key on anything, because the old Duke's instructions seemed to her to carry a weight she was not ready to press against. She thought now of the nephew's solicitor in London, and the petition for incapacity, and Lady Ashmore's voice carrying effortlessly through a dining room full of witnesses, and she thought, what if the time is now? And she missed it, because she was afraid of what I might find. She put the key in her pocket and went out. The stables at night were quiet in the way that animals are quiet, not empty, but contained. A horse shifted in the second box. The cold October air carried the smell of straw and damp, and the distant smoke from the house chimney. Clara walked the length of the block with her candle held low, past the boxes, past the tack room with its rows of bridles, to the small locked room at the block's far end that she had noticed on her first visit and had assumed was for feed or equipment. The iron key turned the lock on the second try. Inside was a room the size of a large cupboard, a single shelf. On the shelf, a wooden box, not large, with a hasp that took the same iron key on the first try. Inside the box were two documents. The first was a letter in an old man's hand, the ink faded to brown, the date at the top reading the 12th of March, 1802. It was addressed to Mr. Edmund Bowman, and it began, I owe you a debt I have not known how to discharge. The hand steadied as it continued. It described, in plain language, an afternoon in late winter when a burning barn had produced in its rafters a beam that fell, and a man who had pulled his employer from its path, and what that man had cost himself in the doing. 3 ribs broken, a shoulder that never fully healed, and what his employer had given him in return, which was his position, his wages, his lodgings, and nothing more. The letter called itself a confession. I was a coward, it said. I told myself that to elevate you further would embarrass you. I told myself this for 20 years. I am ashamed of it. The letter had never been sent. Clara stood in the small dark room and read the letter twice, and then held it against her chest and breathed carefully until her eyes cleared. The second document was different. It bore the seal of Ashmore's own solicitor, Mr. Graves, as witness, and it was dated just 6 months earlier, in April 1811. It was the old Duke's personal testament, addressed to the Court of Chancery and to any interested party who might seek to contest the bequest. It described his service in full. It described the fire. It named the surgeon who had attended to Edmund's injuries. It named the footman who had witnessed the incident. It stated that the bequest to Edmund's only surviving child was not an eccentric gesture or the product of a diminished mind, but the discharge of a debt of honor that had been 31 years overdue. At the bottom, below the old Duke's signature, was a note in Mr. Graves's hand attesting that His Grace was entirely lucid on the date of this signing and expressed these wishes with full understanding and firm intention. The petition for incapacity had no ground to stand on. Clara folded both documents with great care. She put them inside her coat, against her chest, and locked the room, and walked back across the dark forecourt with the candle in one hand and the iron key in the other, and her heart beating very steadily, as her father's heart, she imagined, had beaten on the afternoon he ran into a burning barn. She found Lord Thornmere in the study. He looked up from the desk when she came in without knocking. She set the 2 documents on the desk in front of him, side by side, and stepped back. She did not speak while he read. She watched his face, which was very still, and saw the precise moment, about 3 sentences into the personal testament, when the stillness became something else. It was not a dramatic change. It was a particular quality of attention that a careful person develops only when something has struck them in a place they did not know was unguarded. He read both documents in full. Then he sat back. He looked at Clara. "Where was this?" he said. "In the locked room at the end of the stable block." She set the iron key on the desk beside the documents. "He left it with the will, I think, because he knew someone would try to challenge it. He wanted me to find the proof in time." Lord Thornmere looked at the key. He looked at her. "He was watching you," he said slowly. "He wanted to know what you were made of before he trusted you with this." "Yes," said Clara. "And I think he waited until I came back to the stables. The night I went alone." Lord Thornmere was silent for a long moment. She could hear the fire. Outside the study window, the October night was fully dark. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You upheld the will. You did not fail me, my lord." "I looked at you," he said, "and I thought, at first, that this was a complication, that the old Duke had been, perhaps, indulgent. I thought it very carefully, and was wrong very completely." She did not answer immediately. The firelight moved across the brass buttons of his coat, across the thin scar at his temple, across the gray-green eyes that were looking at her now with none of the careful neutrality they had worn for the past week. "You were not wrong that it was a complication," she said. "No, I was wrong about what kind, entirely." The dinner the following evening was not by Clara's arrangement. It had been called by Lady Ashmore herself. She had sent notes to the same company as before, and added 2 of Norton's particular friends, and the solicitor from London whose letter had arrived 4 days prior. Clara had been given no notice of it. She learned of it from Ellen, who appeared in the east wing doorway with red patches on her cheeks and the stiff bearing of a woman carrying information she knows is being used against someone she has come to like. "Lady Ashmore has arranged a dinner," Ellen said, "for tonight. She has asked Mr. Fitch, Norton's man from London, to attend." "I know," said Clara, though she had not known. "Thank you, Ellen." She dressed with care. She had only the dove-gray gown and one other, a dark green wool that had been her mother's, and which fitted her through the shoulders and loose at the waist, but whose color was good. She wore the green. She pinned her dark auburn hair close at the nape, leaving the loose strands at the temples, and did not try to elaborate it beyond her means. She could not compete with the woman in lavender, or the polished comfort of people who had dressed for society since they were old enough to be introduced to it. She put the iron key in her pocket. She went down. The dining room was full. Lady Ashmore occupied her customary position at the head, the dove-black gown and the jet mourning jewels and the black feathered fan composed into an image of authority so perfectly arranged that Clara felt the weight of it simply by crossing the threshold. The nephew sat at his mother's right. The solicitor from London, Mr. Fitch, was to Lady Ashmore's left, with the bearing of a man who believed he was about to be useful. Lord Thornmere was seated near the table's center, in the same position as before. Clara took her seat at the lower end. The clergyman was again beside her. He greeted the salt cellar. Lady Ashmore waited until the first course was underway. "I have asked Mr. Fitch to share a few preliminary observations," she said, addressing the table in general, "regarding the legal situation." Mr. Fitch set down his glass with the professional gravity of a man clearing his throat in Latin. "The petition," he began, "turns on the question of—" "I would like to speak first," said Lord Thornmere. He did not raise his voice. He simply spoke. And the particular quality of his voice in the room, the same quality that had stopped Lady Ashmore's fan at the previous dinner, caused a particular kind of silence. He rose. He had the personal testament in his hand. He read it aloud, in full, in the same unhurried voice he had used at the will reading. He did not editorialize. He did not comment. He read every sentence of it, the fire and the broken ribs, the shoulder that never healed, the 31 years of carried shame, the old Duke's own words about what he had done and what he had never been given. When he finished, he set the document on the table. "Miss Bowman is the rightful heir," he said. "She will be treated accordingly." The room was very quiet. Lady Ashmore's fan was perfectly still. She sat with it in her lap, her dark gray eyes on Lord Thornmere, and Clara watched something move behind those eyes. Not the recalibration of the anteroom, which had been strategic, but something closer to a reckoning, an adjusting of certain long-held calculations that the room had just made unfeasible. She was not a woman who would say she had been wrong. She was a woman who would eventually proceed differently. The nephew looked at Mr. Fitch. Mr. Fitch had the expression of a man deciding how many miles it was back to London. The woman in lavender turned to look at Clara. Her expression was not hostile. It was the particular expression of someone reassessing a situation in which they had been given incorrect information and had acted on it faithfully. The clergyman said something to the salt cellar, and it sounded, for the first time, like a benediction. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at the nephew. She did not look at Lady Ashmore. She looked at the table in front of her, at the candlelight on the white cloth. And she breathed carefully through the warmth that was spreading across her chest. And she did not permit herself to do what would have been the easiest and least dignified thing in the world, which was to look at him with the fullness of what she felt. She would do that later, in the kitchen garden, when the dinner was over and the guests had dispersed and the house had settled into its own quiet, and he came to find her standing among the bare beds, with her face tipped up to the cold October sky. He did not say anything at first. He stood a few feet away, his hands at his sides, his breath visible in the cold air. The moon was up, thin and very bright, and the kitchen garden smelled of turned earth and cold. "You should be indoors," he said at last. "Should I?" she said. It was not quite a question. "You will take a chill." "I have been cold before, my lord." A pause. The thin moon moved behind a cloud and came out again. "Clara," he said. She had not heard her given name in his voice before. It was the same voice he used for everything, level, unhurried, but something in the particular weight he put on the two syllables made her turn to face him. He was looking at her in the way she had seen in the hayloft, in the kitchen garden the previous day, in the study last night across the personal testament. A look that did not try to manage itself. "I should have recognized from the beginning," he said, what the old Duke recognized. "I was too concerned with the form of things." "The form of things matters," she said. "Not more than the substance." She looked at him. The moonlight was very clear on the thin scar at his temple, the gray-green eyes, the still face with its careful arrangement beginning, at last, to come unordered. "You have been in pain for 3 years," she said. He was still for a long moment. "Yes, and you have managed it very well." "I have managed it," he said. "Whether well is a separate question." She took a step toward him, and then stopped, because she was not at all certain what she intended by it. Her heart was beating in a way she had no useful vocabulary for, a way that was not alarm and not composure, but something else entirely, something that lived in the body before it reached the mind. "I told you I had not come for the house," she said. "I know. I do not know what else I have come for. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps, deliberate and without hurry, as though he had calculated it and decided, and his hand came up to her face very gently, gloved fingers at the line of her jaw, and he looked at her with those gray-green eyes that were not still at all now, that were very full of something they had been refusing, for a very long time, to be full of. He did not kiss her immediately. He waited. He held her gaze in the cold moonlit garden for a breath, and then another, as though committing something to memory, or perhaps discovering it for the first time. "Stay," he said, "at Ashmore, until this is resolved, and beyond it. I find that I would very much like you to stay." She put her hand over his where it rested at her jaw. His pulse was visible at his wrist, just at the cuff of his glove. She felt it under her fingers, quick and human and entirely unguarded. "You will need to ask me properly," she said. "I know," he said. "Later," she said, "when you have had time to decide what you mean." He almost smiled. It was a very small event, but it reordered the architecture of his face entirely, and she understood that she had just witnessed something rare. His hand, still cupped at her jaw, turned slightly, and his thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with the deliberateness of a man deciding something fully and without reservation. Then he let his hand fall, and they stood in the cold kitchen garden a few inches apart. Not quite touching. The October air bright and sharp between them. And that not quite touching was its own kind of fullness. The kind that can only exist before the moment that makes it different. The winter came in gently that year. The hearing in November lasted 2 days, and on the second day Mr. Graves presented the personal testament to the court, and the footman who had witnessed the fire in 1802 was located in a village 12 miles away, now quite elderly, and gave a clear account of what he had seen. The petition was withdrawn before the end of the second afternoon. The nephew's solicitor returned to London. Norton himself remained at Ashmore for a week, and then departed for his mother's house in Bath, and Lady Ashmore followed him the week after, with a courtesy toward Clara that was, if not warm, at least correctly measured. Clara took possession of the Ashmore Dower House on the first day of December. It was smaller than the main house and older, its stone walls thick and its fires stubborn to light, and she loved it immediately and unreservedly. Mrs. Holt came with her as housekeeper, by her own choice. Ellen came as housemaid. The Dower House's windows looked east across the home farm and the edge of the kitchen garden, and in the mornings the light on the stone was very fine. She had the old Duke's letter to her father framed in plain wood and hung in the hall, where anyone who came to the door would see it. It was not, she thought, a triumphant thing. It was a true thing, which was more lasting. He came to call on the 22nd of December. He came with a riding coat dusted with the morning's first snow, and she answered the door herself because Ellen was at the market. And Mrs. Holt was in the kitchen, and she stood in the Dower House doorway with the wood fire crackling behind her, and the smell of pine boughs from the arrangement she had made that morning, and looked at him in his navy tailcoat with brass buttons, and his gray-green eyes, and his thin scar, and the small iron key held out in his gloved hand. "You left this with me," he said. She had. She had left it with Mr. Graves after the hearing, and asked him to convey it to Lord Thornmere, and she had not been certain at the time whether she intended it as a closing or an opening. She had been waiting to find out. She took the key from his hand. Their gloved fingers touched briefly, and the quality of that brief contact was not at all gloved. "I thought it ought to come back to Ashmore," she said. "It is back at Ashmore," he said. She looked at him. The snow was very light, a few flakes against the gray December sky, catching the Dower House's morning light. "I have had time," he said, to decide what I mean." "I know," she said. "Will you walk with me this evening? By the stables, as I asked before?" "Yes," she said. She stepped back to let him in, and the door stood open behind them both, and the hall was warm, and above the door her father's letter hung in its plain wooden frame, every word of it true, the iron key she placed on the hall table, where it caught the winter light. It was not a pretty thing. It was exactly itself, which was enough.